Ryan and Kevin for our Ken Seminar series presentation. First of all, I'd like to thank both of them, Kevin and Ryan, for coming over here to give this presentation for us. And Ryan is an associate professor in the University of Southern Illinois University in Edwardsville, and then Kevin is an ITS operations engineer from IDOT. Today, they're going to talk about their findings from a project they recently finished, the two-phase project, and the title of their talk is about the review of IDOT real-time travel information. So before they start their presentation, let's give them a round of applause.
Good afternoon. So a lot of things we're going to cover in our presentation today. Again, with the traveler information background, where this reason for this research came from. Ryan's going to go into a lot of the peer feedback and compliance strategies that him and his grad students were researching. Part of this requirement also included updating our ITS architectures. We're also in the midst of a major statewide update, so not just for this piece, but for the larger architecture update strategic plan. So there's a good timing there as well. And go through some compliance evaluation and conclusion statements. A little background. This actually started way back, I guess you can say back in 2005 with the safety legislation, where they wanted to improve the real-time traveler information dissemination to the public to give people more information on how they're traveling, maybe pre or during, whatever the case may be, in a way, in a sense, to help reduce congestion. But they found that it's not just for the metropolitan areas, but also for statewide interstates. And that's where the final rule in 2010 by the FHWA was a lot of requests back and forth with FHWA looking for feedback on how they should develop this rule. And that's where 2014, 2010 came out the rule and saying it needed to be implemented by 2014, at least part one. There's actually a part two as well that needs to be implemented by the end of 2016. So it really breaks down to these specific elements. In the metropolitan regions, we want travel times on the interstates. For statewide interstates, construction information, what lanes are impacted. Is it a full closure, partial closure? Same with traffic incidents. Are you closing lanes? Is it a full closure? And then weather, how it affects your travel. With that, they actually introduced the idea that we need to measure our quality of data. So you can sense, for those that follow transportation authorization, those whatever else, MAP 21 here a few years ago, the recent authorization we're working under in its current extensions, introduced all these other performance metrics that the states are having to figure out for asset management and road pavement conditions, whatever else. You can almost say that had it start back with this ruling, you can almost call it performance metrics for traveler information. We have an accuracy component of 85%, an availability of 90%. There's a timeliness element where in the metropolitan regions, you have to have things reported within 10 minutes. Outside the metropolitan regions, items have to be reported within 20 minutes. And the coverage, again, starting with the interstates nationwide, and then in the metropolitan regions, that's like kind of the phase two where we start talking about routes of significance.
This guy knows how to speak.
The other thing with the coverage too, when they also gave us some sort of start on a definition of what a metropolitan region is. You think, well, a metropolitan region, that should be easy. But again, we're trying to be less ambiguous, more defined. And so they started with metropolitan statistical areas defined by, I think, the President's office through, I forget which bureau now it was, but the whole idea of population of 1 million or more, that would be your metropolitan area. Well, and even the ruling back in 2010, they even did the unusual step of asking for feedback. And we actually provided feedback about, well, you say we're supposed to work with our metropolitan planning organizations to define these areas. So we've had some back and forth with the FHWA reps on how some of these definitions work out. And that's where kind of Ryan comes into play here.
Thank you, Kevin. So our role in this ICT-sponsored project was the main part was to develop compliance strategies, tried to connect what IDOT was currently doing in practice with what needed to be done in compliance with this new regulation. One of the first tasks we did was try to gather peer feedback meaning from other departments of transportation that were also working towards meeting this compliance, and then basically evaluate which strategies are most relevant and describe how to actually implement them. So that was the first part that I'll talk about here. When we discussed these ideas with, or surveyed other state DOTs, we received decent feedback here, the red showing which states did respond to our survey. And one of the things we noted with respect to the states that did not respond is that several of the states that didn't respond seem to be on the forefront of addressing compliance with this law. For example, I believe it was Tennessee and California were two of the presenters in one of the upcoming the webinars that were describing how to address this upcoming law when it was back in 2014. For this survey, we gathered information on those 4 different key information types, one of them being travel time. And we asked everyone, what are you doing currently to provide travel time? What do you consider an accurate travel time? And how do you measure that? One of the findings here shows that with respect to what everyone considered accurate, the feedback from the DOTs did reach FHWA, did make it into this final threshold of 85% accuracy rate for the travel times, because most of the respondents considered within 15% as an accurate travel time. What we also found out was that most of our respondents were not checking their accuracy other than right during deployment. After it was deployed, it was assumed the system was functioning properly unless they heard outcry from the public, as in the form of phone calls usually. And I'll just glance over some of the key findings here from this survey. With respect to construction practices, we asked other DOTs, how are you informed when a lane is closed? Now, normally DOTs, yes, are asked for permission first from a contractor if the contractor is allowed to close a lane, especially on an interstate, because of the safety implications, etc., and to also manage multiple projects on the same route. However, what we were asking is it required in real time? So although your contractor may have permission to close the lane at 9 a.m. or 10 a.m., do they have to call in if they are ahead or behind of that deadline? For example, this specification or the regulation, as Kevin had mentioned, requires that in metro areas, lane closures need to be reported to the public within 10 minutes. If there's no requirement for contractors to notify the Department of Transportation, there might be a problem here. As you can see, that 63%. Other agencies do have contractors required to inform the Department of Transportation, and some only know about planned lane closures. So there's a lot of work to do here from DOTs across the country. With respect to incident practices, commonly what we've heard from discussing with stakeholders around the state is sometimes there were incidents that they were unaware of, and possibly until the next day. And those incidents, if the DOT is responsible for reporting them to the public, a mechanism needs to be established so that that information can be given to IDOT so that IDOT can inform the public. 20 out of the 38 responders identified they already had an existing policy or guide that facilitated that flow of information. I think 8 had current standard practices, so although it wasn't specified in a policy document or statement, they commonly had a working relationship. And there were several others that had no mechanism right now for reporting incidents and gathering that information. And lastly, within weather, perhaps the most difficult to assess, we asked other agencies, how much do you use different sources to collect your weather information when you disseminate road conditions to the public? Here, RWIS stations, or road weather information stations. If you look at the white bars on the top, that's the number we focused on most, and that's how many agencies reported. They always use this type of data. And you can see RWIS stations and National Weather Service are certainly the two most common from around the respondents that I suppose responded to our survey. That was just a brief overview of some of the key things we learned from other stakeholders around the country, other DOTs and their districts. So I'll talk about now, one of the big parts of our project was to identify how we should meet compliance, or how we recommend IDOT work towards compliance. First, we took a look at the accuracy standard. All of the data that's provided to the public, how do we measure accuracy for it? When looking at the 4 different types of data, we recognized travel time was in itself a different sort of animal. So we crafted that separately. For construction events, incident events, and weather events, each of those were very similar with respect to the characteristics we were measuring, so we used a different accuracy equation for those. And I'll talk about that in a little more detail in a moment. With respect to availability, that was a little bit more straightforward. We know that from our discussions with stakeholders that there are a few key places where IDOT disseminates this information to the public. And many of them converge towards websites. Although information is disseminated through dynamic message signs on the side of the road, some of the key nexus where information is disseminated happen to be a website Getting Around Illinois and another Travel Midwest. So those 2 websites seem to be the best places to do that evaluation for how frequently is the information available. And we use this equation here, pretty straightforward as far as how we calculate the availability, looking at perhaps an entire year or perhaps just a few months, but a sample to identify on average how available is this information. To recap a little bit on what Kevin touched on with respect to the timeliness deadlines, those criteria are 10 minutes or 20 minutes, depending whether you're in a metro area or outside, and also depending on the type of information. Construction and incidents, yes, have that 10 and 20 minute differentiation. Travel times, because they're only required in metro areas, are always required to be provided to the public within 10 minutes of their calculation. And then with respect to weather information, I'm suspecting because of feedback about how difficult it is to continuously predict weather conditions on roadways and gather that and provide that to the public, 20 minutes is the required turnaround time for metro or non-metro areas regardless. So with that background, I wanted to give you some information on what we had discussed with stakeholders and what our final recommendations were with respect to evaluating the accuracy availability of these different types of data. So for travel times, current practices in the metro areas, in the Chicago and the St. Louis metro areas, and I know we only focused on those 2 because those were the only 2 areas in the state that had more than 1 million population and fell under the purview of this regulation. Those 2 traffic management centers were operated 24 hours a day. They had professional staff that were very familiar with a common travel time of a certain route during a certain time of day. So with respect to those, not sure where I would, with respect to those, a continuous review is ongoing. So if the traffic management center operator recognizes there's something awry with one of their travel times, they can address that. If they receive multiple calls from the public, they can also address that. That continuous review process was already in place. However, to meet compliance, what we recommended was an annual review to evaluate travel times on every single route. Take a look at what is reported to the public, and then take a look at what is a baseline source. How do you compare those 2? And then, as Kevin noted, there's a second phase of this law that kicks in the end of 2016, in November 2016. And at that time, certain routes of significance, only those that are limited access, like freeway style design, those would have to provide travel times as well. For the evaluation, we've got, this is a larger version of the equation on the previous sheet. And because travel time is very quantitative, we can evaluate how close and how accurate each travel time was. Travel time accuracy is a little different than incidents and constructions, for example. Travel time, you can be close, and that would be acceptable. So therefore, we identified how close in minutes to the baseline travel time you would be. And again, we're looking for an accuracy level of 85%. One thing we noted here is that you would complete this equation for each travel time segment that IDOT would perform, and then average that to come up with a system-wide accuracy for the region. If the length of travel time segments vary, one thing we identified in phase one was perhaps you choose to do a weighted average rather than a average based on the number of travel times provided. And if you find a huge variety in the travel time lengths provided, then that might be a good idea. With respect to construction information, we again recommended an annual review once a year. Through discussions with Federal Highway Administration and IDOT stakeholders, we identified a threshold of 25%, a sample size of 25% of all ongoing lane closing construction projects at a given point in time. Take that sample, review them, and compare what's truly going on in the field with respect to lane closures and what's truly being disseminated to the public on the website or by other means. With respect to what we were looking for the differentiation between a full and a partial closure of the roadway. That was all that was required for compliance. We, in our report, noted that IDOT was striving towards providing how many lanes are open and how many lanes are closed. However, that doesn't necessarily have to be there for compliance. Additionally, certainly you as travelers would appreciate if the construction information was given for the correct segment of roadway, and that the start and end times were correct, meaning the contractor did not neglect to inform IDOT that all lanes are open again. So we wanted to make sure all four pieces of those information were available and accurate. And we used the equation shown here, basically averaging how many samples we audited versus how many were accurate. And again, looking for that 85% level. One example I wanted to give that Kevin had mentioned to me before is it's difficult sometimes to put a quantity on construction projects, because an example is a moving operation that is patching potholes. Now, patching each pothole may not take 10 minutes, probably not 20 minutes either. But however, how long will that patching operation take place along that segment of roadway? It's certainly a gray area. And there's plenty of these gray areas in trying to meet compliance with this regulation. And thus, we've got a lot of opportunities for finding these details when we're trying to meet this regulation. And that's why a lot of this study was conducted in close cooperation with the review panel and with feedback from stakeholders. Okay, for incident information, we were looking overall at the same type of incident, the same type of accuracy equation we used before. We took a look at how many roadway or lane blocking incidents were reported accurately to the state, divided by how many were sampled, and we were looking for 85% as our minimum. Then it brought us into a discussion of, how many incidents should we sample. So to identify this, we took a sample of data from a Chicago area traffic management center, looked at approximately a year's worth of traffic incidents, and looked at their accuracy. Then based on that, identified how many would we need to sample to identify the same accuracy level as if we looked at every incident for the whole year. We conservatively predicted then use a 15% sample size, and you should have no problem identifying the true accuracy with an acceptable level of confidence. Okay, lastly, weather information. This was one that we struggled with quite a bit because it's much less quantitative than any of the other areas. How do you assess if you're providing weather information accurately? So with respect to this, after stakeholder meetings, we identified that conducting an annual review similar to the other types of information would be appropriate. And because of Illinois and their operations commonly being challenged by snow and winter weather events, we thought that those would be more appropriate as samples. So we identified that based on the number of storms that IDOT usually encounters each year, selecting a sample of 2 storms randomly and making sure that your sample included at least 12 hours of weather information. And then compare what IDOT was disseminating, usually through their winter road conditions map, and comparing that to a baseline source that's trusted to identify where each of those segments of time reported accurately? Was the weather reported accurately? Okay, with respect to the weather events, after we sampled those, we would break them into time intervals. We recommended time intervals anywhere between 20 minutes to no more than 2 hours. So break them into segments, then evaluate each segment individually. This would be more of a qualitative assessment for each time segment. Identify for all of the different areas, was the information accurate? And then sum up how many time segments were accurately reported to the public, how many were not. As far as baseline sources, what we recommended is perhaps viewing or collecting information disseminated by the National Weather Service as far as current conditions. Could also collect information from active road weather RWIS stations, road weather information services, or a weather vendor. However, note that sometimes weather vendors are providing the forecast, not always current conditions. So current conditions is what you'd want. Okay, and then for the accuracy, same equation that we use for construction incidents, and same levels except timeliness was 20 minutes. Okay, that covers how we fleshed out the method for evaluating accuracy. For availability, we were mainly going to look at the 2 different key websites that IDOT disseminates traveler information, apply this equation, and come up with a percentage of information availability, considering that all the information was making it to the website. So once it made it to the website, if the website was available, then that would be your availability rating. Okay, that is a very brief summary of what we went through with respect to some suggestions for compliance for accuracy and availability. The next part of our project, we evaluated ITS architectures. Throughout the state, there are several different architectures that guide the development and deployment of technology that supports transportation operations, safety, etc. What we did for each architecture was reviewed what communication was taking place, what was planned, etc. For those of you that haven't had a class or are unfamiliar with intelligent transportation systems, this is nothing more than a framework or plan for how different technologies will communicate with each other. It's completely vendor or technology independent. It's just describing what functions need to take place and what information needs to be communicated. We reviewed each architecture to identify basically what was missing that is needed to inform the public of these 4 types of traveler information. And we made recommendations so that the vendor or contractor that would subsequently update those architectures could include that information. And that's, I think, to date been included in the St. Louis bi-state regional architecture. We met with their team and those changes are on the way. And I know the state ITS architecture is starting its update process as well. So those will be in place. That was a very quick overview of the first phase we did in this project. Mainly our deliverables were guidance towards compliance. Some of the key ones were responsibilities. Real-time traveler information doesn't stop just because the district office has certain hours. So we need to develop a plan for how do we provide 24/7 coverage for rural districts, for example. So we met again with IDOT stakeholders, had several telephone conversations to identify how would each district relay their information to some center that operates 24 hours a day. So we established those responsibilities. We also identified which sections of the interstate around our metro areas are still not providing travel times. So in the St. Louis area and in the Chicago area, there are each some small sections, some not so small, but some sections where travel times aren't provided to the public right now. The devices installed on the freeway and the maintenance of them is very expensive, so it's a slow process, but we identified which sections should be expanded to meet compliance. Next, to perform an annual assessment of accuracy or availability, you would need to save some data throughout the year so that the employees in charge of the assessment would have that information to work with. So we recommended data archiving of a couple key pieces of information throughout the year. Some other assessments could be done at that time. Evaluation strategies we just talked about. And then lastly, from our first phase, we identified a few policy changes that could help support compliance with this law. One policy change had to do with Illinois State Police communication with Illinois Department of Transportation. They have a joint operational policy statement, and in that statement it describes what each of them should communicate with the other. For example, when there's a crash that would damage a guardrail, state police is required to inform IDOT, etc. However, what was not in that policy was anything about lane closing traffic incidents. So one of our recommendations was to include such verbiage and made some suggestions. The compliance evaluation is what we've sort of been fast tracking since March till now. We finished a compliance evaluation for all these types of traveler information, and I'll report in the rest of my time here what we found and certainly answer questions. The first one we tackled was travel time information. For an assessment of the travel time, recall we're looking at a system-wide compliance. We're not looking at evaluating one route's travel time specifically. We're looking at, is the whole system about at 85%, and can we measure that as closely as possible? We started with the Chicago metropolitan area, and we evaluated all of the interstates that IDOT operated, not those that are operated by other, toll authority, etc. Those still must comply with the law, but was out of the scope of our study. So these interstates we did evaluate, and for each interstate, we looked at how many travel times IDOT currently provides to the public. So there were 81 different travel times. Many of them overlapped. For example, as you drive down a route towards downtown Chicago, you'll receive several different travel times as you progress further to the city. So each of them were evaluated independently. We also wanted to make sure that there weren't different levels of accuracy at different times of day. So we looked at the morning rush hour, or 7 to 9 a.m. roughly, evening peak hours, and then off-peak, and evaluated all 81 of those samples with respect to one time or another. We gathered information from the Travel Midwest website, and we considered when that data was reported as our timestamp. We used Google Maps as our baseline source. Choosing a baseline source was something that certainly challenged our research team. You want to choose valid data to compare against, especially if you're trying to form an accuracy estimate that has to do with federal compliance. We looked at several sources, and the reason we chose Google Maps is because we were more confident that the data Google Maps was providing was not already data that IDOT had provided within the data set. An example might be here.com. The data that's provided there, some of it is from IDOT. So the average they are providing you already includes some IDOT data, so that would skew our sample. Google Maps traditionally takes their information from your cell phone if you're using that app, and you would be a probe vehicle yourself. One of our assumptions in using this is that there were an adequate sample size on the road, especially during peak hours, that would make sure our travel time provided from Google Maps was as accurate as possible. For the off-peak times, there probably were not as many vehicles using Google Maps during those times. However, travel times are much more consistent because they're much less impacted by congestion. So those were our assumptions going in. When we looked at all the travel time segments, all 81 segments, we found they ranged in length from 1 mile all the way to 38 miles. There's a big diversity there with respect to their length. So we chose to use a weighted average. We weighted the travel times based on their length, so that a longer travel time would be weighted a bit more because we're looking at the amount of road miles that travel times provided over. When we applied that, we did a weighted average for the Chicago area. They're just above the 85. I believe it was 85.6. So the accuracy met compliance. This helped us identify some segments that were unavailable. There were a few travel time segments that the data was unavailable, likely because detectors being down in the field. And we also did quite a few analyses to see, was the accuracy changing by length of the travel time? For example, was the 38-mile travel time significantly less accurate than the 5-mile travel time? We also were able to identify several other trends in the data with respect to which interstates were more accurate and where might future maintenance funds help the most. So with respect to that, we made a nice color-coded map here with respect to the accuracy. Green represents above 85%. The thicker the line here means we have more data samples and are more confident with our accuracy prediction. So as you see, we move further away from the downtown Chicago area, our line's thin because we have less travel time samples as far as the confidence of the accuracy. What we found was there was a few key interstates that could use more improvement than the others. So 57 and I-80 were the lowest with respect to travel time accuracy for the samples that we collected. We also identified that to improve the availability, some down detectors need to be fixed. And then we waited for the St. Louis region towards the end of our travel time analysis. There were some significant software, hardware problems there. So the system is working towards online, but it's still not fully online yet for this sort of assessment. So I know it's working towards that right now. With respect to the construction information, how do we apply this and what did we find? What we did was look on the Getting Around Illinois website. On a certain time of day, we pulled the website, what construction projects were reported to the public. We thinned those down, identified just those along interstates, and thinned those down again to just those that were closing lanes. And then we took a 25% sample of those to review. That worked out to, I think, maybe about 60 projects for the state. And what we did is compare what was provided on the website right then to what was actually going on in the field and looked for that full or partial closure. Was that correct and accurate? Was the correct road segment disseminated? And then if the project had just closed or just opened a lane, was that information reported in a timely fashion within the 10 or 20 minutes, etc. Reviewing that, we found some best practices. Even though we proposed this method, we found some trouble implementing it always because it takes quite a bit of time to accurately assess all these. What we found is one of the best practices was honestly to pick up the phone and call the IDOT resident engineer that was on site, familiar with what was going on, and ask them what are current conditions. We usually did this with the help of the district operations engineer and under the assumption that resident engineer would have no need to dissuade us or tell us incorrect information with their boss on the phone. So we were confident of our information collected there. Many of the sites, we collected actual real-time information of what was going on from a resident engineer's perspective. Many of those, well, not many, some of those we were not able to contact a resident engineer. So we physically drove through the site and assessed was real-time information provided accurately. And then lastly, in the metro areas, in District 8 and District 1, and I believe actually in District 6, we were also able to use a traffic camera to zoom in, see the actual construction activities with respect to lanes open and closed. So we used our accuracy equation, and what we found was, that's the next slide. Okay, I won't spoil the surprise for you. I've got one more. We not only looked at lanes open and lanes closed, some of the other things we were taking a look at just to provide more value to IDOT for this analysis was, were the lane restrictions reported correctly? Were the bridge restrictions reported correctly? And then how that impacts is for the oversized overweight loads. Were all of those restrictions reported correctly? We looked at the timeliness, but all of the sites, all of the samples we reviewed were not opened or closed within a day or so of when we did the analysis. So there was no information we could have collected as far as when that information was provided to the public and when exactly was that lane open or closed. For the districts around the state, these are the percentages we found for each district with respect to accuracy. And you can see there's a wide variety between different districts. I also note the sample size is drastically different. It depended on how many active lane closing interstate construction projects, that's a mouthful, how many were going on at that time. And we sampled it. District 5 I think only had one. Districts 1 and 8 I believe had about 10 or 11 each. So that's the perspective of our samples. For the whole state we looked at about 58. And some of the common things we found were that some districts were using a standard statement for all construction that said expect lane closures. And we thought about this a lot as researchers. What should the public perceive as that? Should they expect there will be lane closures or there might? So we thought a bit about this and we found where this statement came from originally. Current practices are for resident engineers to submit a form, Form 2410, to report a construction project's expected lane closures or lane restrictions through its duration, what might take place. What needs to happen next to become in compliance with real-time information is to actually report if those lane closures or restrictions change in real time. So many times we found that the initial the initial information was provided and did not change, even though lanes had opened then closed again during the duration of a project. We suggest training could improve this reporting, making sure that everyone involved with the closing and opening of lanes is familiar that this information needs to be reported to who, and then where it needs to go from there. One other item we identified was that the standard specification that IDOT currently has does not require contractors to report this information. They need to ask about their, basically request when they can close lanes in the beginning of a project. However, there's no requirement for them to inform IDOT in real time when lanes are closed or if they end early and reopen lanes. One of our recommendations was to provide some additional general notes to contract plans until standard specifications can be updated. And in this part of the project, we reviewed section 701 of the standard specs and made some recommendations for where verbiage should be included and made some suggestions on what it might be as far as a start-off point for IDOT to make that conversation happen. Okay, for incident information, for all the crashes that close interstate lanes, IDOT currently had an established policy that all district offices were required to report those incidents to Station 1, which is a communication hub in IDOT's headquarters if you're unfamiliar. So the Station 1 center has a database that records all of those. We received a copy of that database, went through another sorting process, sorted out all incidents that were not along interstates, sorted out all incidents that did not close lanes, sorted out all incidents that may not have truly been incidents as far as we were working towards in this project. We used that 15% sample size and then evaluated each of those incidents for 4 pieces of information. What was a full or partial closure reported to the public? Or did the dynamic message signer website just say incident ahead? Because need to inform the public so that they make good decisions with respect to their routes and travel decisions. That's the purpose behind all of this real-time legislation. Next, was the appropriate road segment reported to the public? And then lastly, was a start time and end time reported to the public? And this is many times what we heard from interviews is IDOT may have had difficulties, especially more in rural areas that don't operate 24/7. How are they informed of the start time of an incident if their office might not operate all hours? Of all the incidents we reviewed, we broke them down to those that were reported completely accurately and those that were, if they were receiving some inaccurate information based on other stakeholder discussions, we decided that those would have to be inaccurate. Because as a motorist, if you're informed that there is an incident closing all lanes, that was correct, and you were informed the correct start time, but you were informed the wrong section of roadway, that would be inaccurate to suppose guide your travel. So we consider that inaccurate. Overall, for incidents, we found an 87% accuracy rate. For the period we looked at, we took a database swath from November 8th when the law became effective all the way to March 31st, looked at 153 incidents, and our sample size came out to 23 incidents. And of those, there was only a few that were inaccurate. One gave no report of how many lanes were closed, full or partial. Another one had no report of how many lanes were closed. And then the last one did not report that the lanes had opened again. So we really couldn't identify any pattern based on this sample, but the overall accuracy is meeting compliance, meeting the compliance threshold. With respect to our recommendations, we'd encourage to make sure that all of the districts and other agencies observing lane closing incidents on interstates are making sure that information is provided to Station 1, and then Station 1 ensures that communication link between their communication center and the website remains functional. Let's see, other policies. I list here ISP JOP, Illinois State Police Joint Operational Policy Statement. That is one that I already talked about, and that would be a great place to include some revisions that require state police and make them aware that they should inform IDOT of lane closings and within how many minutes, etc. And then lastly, training might help local law enforcement be aware that IDOT would like this information, especially on their interstates. We've heard from stakeholders that some jurisdictions, local police do find and respond to incidents along the interstates, and they don't always know what ISP is supposed to do in those situations. So making sure that they are also aware of the data IDOT would like from those incidents. Okay, weather information, my last one here. What we found was there was limited information for comparison. When we did our evaluation, there wasn't any baseline data recorded that we could use for our evaluation. What we tried to use as our baseline data, we looked at Schneider Electric. That is a weather contractor that IDOT uses for 8 out of the 9 districts. That information was available, but many times it's a forecast in the future, not always of real-time existing weather conditions. We looked at information from the National Weather Service, but it was difficult to get it in a form that's comparable to weather conditions on the road on a specific interstate. Many times it's given as far as precipitation in a county. It's difficult to make that jump between the two. Road weather information stations, I did review data from several of those. It is archived, however, I wasn't very confident with the data coming out of some of the stations we were looking at. These again are technological systems that require continuing maintenance, etc. And to have a baseline source, we wanted to be sure we were evaluating something that we had confidence in. Our recommendations for this weather review is that the weather road condition map should start an archive, perhaps in operations. Right now, IDOT headquarters GIS division helps generate those maps and does have an archive of those. So need to make sure that operations has access to that. And then start archiving a baseline source in real time. So at the end of the year, when an annual evaluation takes place and you choose 2 storms to evaluate, that baseline data is there already, and you don't have to go try to back collect it from other sources. What we did from some of the sources we looked at, some initial indications suggest that the start and end times of storms, when winter weather does start to impact the roadways, some of the sources we saw suggested maybe those would be the common sources for error, because our baseline sources, the Schneider Electric and some, we use, I think, Weather Underground too, just to take a quick look at those. We saw that the start times and end times didn't always match. So that might be a place to look into for further improvement. Okay, because in November 2016, the Illinois Department of Transportation must start providing this real-time information along additional routes. They term these routes of significance in the regulation. IDOT and Federal Highway were charged with identifying what are these routes of significance for each metro area. And the regulation provided some guidance on what characteristics you should use to help evaluate or choose these. As researchers, we were in charge of leading this selection project or process. We used a utility analysis type process. We had the stakeholders in, for example, first in the Chicago area in July, we met. We provided them with some potential categories of which should we use to select a route of significance, meaning does traffic volume make a route significant, or does truck volume, or does crashes, or does congestion, and how much of each should make a route significant. We had the stakeholders rate those. We used those as the category rates. We selected which were the most important categories, collected data on them, and then ranked them as shown here with respect to the utility value. And right now, IDOT officials and CMAP, the Chicago Metropolitan Authority for Planning, they are deciding where should the threshold be where a route is not significant versus is significant. And if it is, you need to start planning to provide this real-time traveler information by next November. We did a similar process in the East St. Louis area with the help of the East-West Gateway Council of Governments. Okay, so on to some conclusions, and I'll have Kevin come up and talk a little bit about some future steps IDOT's taking with respect to real-time traveler information. Overall, what we were identifying were which tasks would need to take place to make sure IDOT was in compliance and can come in compliance with this law. We identified some infrastructure For example, more travel time data collection and provision to the public along certain interstate routes. We identified some policy changes. For example, the standard specifications, the state police and IDOT joint operational policy statement. And we also identified a few areas where training within agency and perhaps with local law enforcement could help with the reporting of this real-time traveler information. And what we did in this second phase was really try our own soup. We tried the method we proposed and evaluated how well it worked. We identified some best practices. For example, for collecting construction information, it worked quite well and efficiently to establish a time with the region or district's operations engineer and call the resident engineers for the selected projects. Okay. With that said, next steps. I'll have Kevin talk a little bit and then we can answer questions together.
So this is just a kind of a sample of the many irons we have in the fire, so to speak, for different things we need to do. The joint operational policy between IDOT and the state police, the last time it had been updated probably was over a decade ago. And there's been a lot of discussion over the years about trying to go in there and update the language. So in a sense, the fact that this regulation came out helped move that discussion forward. And they've had actually multiple meetings, joint meetings together at different levels to finally, they're actually very close to updating this policy officially. And they're even talking about additional training to get it down towards, they say, the boots on the street people that actually interact with each other, the highway maintainer or our Minutemen with our emergency traffic patrol and with the state police trooper to actually work out how we're communicating this information back and forth. Other updates, like for instance, our winter road conditions map, understanding how, where, if this data is being archived, how can we get access it more readily so we can perform this metric analysis, as well as updates to our other websites as well. For instance, our Travel Midwest website was more of a regional website both for the Gary, Chicago, and Milwaukee area, and it's been expanding along that corridor. We recently have managed to make it statewide for Illinois as well. Still working on kind of getting some of those data elements from across the state into there. We're moving forward on that. Construction lane closure notification, again, just taking the recommendations and working out, putting it into our contracts with our contractors. Need to work on that language so we can put into the special provisions. Outside of our research project here, something that the Chicago district was looking at was an automated lane closure system. They get lane closure requests for construction purposes or permit purposes on a daily basis, and just trying to manage that by paper was getting to be a very big burden. So they found a way, worked with another university, no offense, Ryan, that we had under contract for maintaining our website, and built an automated system where the contractor could go in themselves, log in, put in the request, and that way we can even lump together different construction projects, closure requests, if they happen to be adjacent, and or deny ones that overlapped, were conflicting. So now we're starting to look, that's having some success up north. Perhaps we're looking at rolling that out statewide. As Ryan mentioned, there's routes of significance that are coming up later. Like I said, there's a lot of other irons in the fire. I was in an operations meeting earlier. There's a lot of talk about updating our roadway weather information system sensors. We've got a number of them that are out, or incomplete data sets, incomplete sensors. There's starting to be a push more by our district operations people to finally get a big push to either update, upgrade, get them all working again. And then incident reporting is kind of a big thing too, where we have all these different districts reporting to Station 1 on closures that happen. So there's some policy updates we've been noticing there too that may need some tweaking. The policy was if it's closed for 30 minutes or more. Well, our regulation now says 20 minutes or 10 minutes in a metropolitan region. So we might have to change that policy. Plus, we can, both literal and figurative, we're playing the telephone game. We got this district calling the station one and just trying to keep all the information consistent. So there may be some future-looking things where we might have a statewide system so they're all entering into the same system for incident reporting. And that kind of is in Safety Lou as well, where they recommend states to have a statewide incident reporting system. And just like to, I guess, acknowledge.
Well, I think I'm supposed to acknowledge. Kevin and Bruce helped guide us through this project, and thank you for them and the ICT for helping us through. And we really appreciate the opportunity to complete this project, and we would be happy to answer questions. Yes?
Are you looking at going towards a smartphone mobile app that can combine the different information sources for motorists?
We do have a mobile app for the Travel Midwest website. We've on our second or third version of that now. We're it's only just recently where we went statewide with that. Up until even a month or two ago, it was more the Chicago metro area, Gary, Indiana, Milwaukee. It went all the way up to, I guess, mid-Wisconsin and over into Michigan a little bit. So we're kind of been putting more and more into that app. There's some thoughts, and I guess some of our development work is to try to maybe get some user feedback in real time too. We haven't developed that part yet. We're still taking baby steps.
How would that compare to, let's say someone uses Google Maps, and my daughter's going to an unnamed college in the South, not one around here, but like there was, Kentucky has a Kentucky 611 or something like that. It's a mobile app that you can use, and it has some things on it and some not. We were using it more for weather, coming back during the winter, and whereas it's icy because it's dicey in those states. In Illinois, it would be handy to have one that had construction versus weather versus closures, all in one little app. But how come Google can get all of that information?
Many times Google is gathering the information from IDOT's websites and then disseminating back out to the public. And I think maybe one of the motivations to providing this regulation or requiring this type of information is so that private sector companies can leverage it, make more value of it, and then provide it to the traveling public.
And that's something we do struggle is, how much of it is our role and how much of it is, the private company role. And since they're so more agile in providing this stuff, and since we're regulated to provide public information, so we feel that we need to do something in this area, and we're just again wrestling with where we get all these different pieces of information and how we put it together and provide it.
Speaking of apps, I've used Google Maps for a while, and I found something else that was interesting. It's called Waze, but I think Google bought it. And it's crowdsourcing. So I've been using that, and it's kind of neat because people, actual drivers, in real time will report on hazards in the road, lane closures, accidents, things like that. So is there any way that any of that type of capability is going to be made more available to the public, or are you guys going to use it for stuff? Because people out there on the roads can report it quite easily.
We haven't looked into that yet. I know a couple other states have, and they actually, I think there's a couple of states that have actually entered into agreements with Waze to get that information and kind of bi-directional for that lane closure information. The one caveat with Waze that you keep hearing is really good at getting the initial information of when it's closed, not so much on the back end when it opens up. So that's the part I think some states are wrestling with, even with their agreements.
And the add to that with respect to the incident notifications, I believe the onus is on IDOT with respect to verify the incident before they send it to the
I could just
public.
go down a perfectly wonderful road and just say, aha, accident, because there's an accident there, and I'd be completely lying about it. But, you know,
Correct.
there's something.
One thing you don't want with intelligent transportation systems is to start to build public distrust after several times of hearing about an incident and not seeing one.
Yeah.
You won't trust the information reliability.
And that's a key term, you know, once it's verified. You know, we've got other time clocks and measuring metrics for incident clearance, whatever else, but, you know, for our real-time traveler information, it's the whole idea is the clock doesn't start until once we've verified through a recognized source that it is closed.
You guys were talking about routes of significance. During your stakeholder meeting, what was the most, or what did the stakeholders give the most value to in terms of criteria for what determines if it's a route of significance? Like you mentioned congestions or.
So I believe for the Chicago area, the 5 categories that were selected were traffic volume, truck volume, congestion index, and crashes, or safety in general. And we collected data on every single route segment about all of those different categories. We normalized the data, and then we used our utility analysis to rank each route based against those criteria. So St. Louis area, I believe it was similar, but I'm trying to think, one of those was not used. I'll have to look in my report.
All right. Any other questions? If not, let's just give a big round of applause for our speakers. And I think, did we arrange the Q&A?
Yeah, we have some students here, so maybe you can want to take.
So if you can stay, maybe stick here for a little bit